you're listening to Sustainably Geeky, episode 81. As a reminder, you can support the show at buymeacoffee.com/sustainablygeeky. Today, I am excited to be speaking about a topic that I've had on my radar for a while, but I haven't actually had the chance to speak to someone on this. So I'm really excited that we have Tzeporah Berman, the founder and co-chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, with us to talk about their work. So Tzeporah, thank you for joining us. And can you start, I guess, by telling us about your sustainability journey and how you came to work in this area?
Sure, thanks for having me. I've been working on sustainability and environmental issues now for 35 years, so a long time. I first started getting interested, I think, when I was still a university student. I remember being on a trip. The first time I really thought about it. I mean, I'm Canadian, so I'm used to having, a lot of green space around me, a lot of parks, a lot of, used to being in nature. And I spent some time traveling through Europe, and that was one of the summers where air pollution was so bad in some of the cities that the cities were being shut down. That was before a lot of the rules and vehicle efficiency that's in place now. And I can remember being in Athens and the whole city was clouded by kind of yellow smog. And when I got to my hotel that night, a hostel, I was coughing up like black goo. And I remember just thinking, like, I've got to get out of here. This is terrible. And I went to Germany to do some hiking with my sister, and we ended up hiking for an entire day through a standing dead forest. No birds, no sounds, no anything. And at the end of that day, we came to a plaque, and some Germans who were there hiking translated it for us, and it said, "This forest has been left standing as a testimony to industrial civilization, what we can do." And it was killed as a result of acid rain. And those two experiences back to back just kind of had this effect on me of kind of opening my eyes to what was happening. And then I feel like once your eyes are open to something, it's like you never see the world the same way again. And I came home from that trip just so thankful for what we had in Canada. And so, like, this is aware to the issues. And then the more aware you are to the issues, the more you realize how big they are. Anyway, so at the time I was in fashion arts design school, and I dropped out, and I applied to the environmental studies program at the University of Toronto. And that was the beginning of my journey.
Yeah, I think so many of us in this space have similar things where once we've learned it, we can't unlearn it, unfortunately, sometimes, because we'd kind of rather bury our head in the sand and not have to have all this anxiety. But
sometimes I wish I could,
I know, like, if only I didn't know that we were destroying everything. But I think those experiences are important as well, because obviously now you're doing great work in this space. And yeah, let's talk about what is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty? I'm going to get that word right. And how was it developed? So tell us kind of the origin story of your organization.
Yeah, we can just call it the Fossil Fuel Treaty. The term non-proliferation I put in there in large part because of the analogy to nuclear non-proliferation. Because in some ways it's similar. I grew up thinking, in an era where the world believed that stockpiling nuclear weapons was what was going to keep us safe. And it was during, my youth that the campaign for nuclear disarmament started happening, and the evidence came out that we already had enough nuclear bombs on the planet to destroy the planet 6 times over. And that the stockpiling of nuclear weapons was actually what was increasing insecurity. It was making us less safe. And that kind of norm shift that went from this is what keeps us safe to actually these are the things that threaten us is I think what helped to create the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Well, today, while climate change is really complicated, what's not complicated is that 86% of the carbon that's trapped in our atmosphere, almost creating like a blanket that's smothering the earth, causing the fires, the floods, the extreme and lethal heat and droughts around the world. All of that is because of this carbon that's trapped in our atmosphere, and it comes from 3 things: oil, gas, and coal. So 86% of the carbon trapped in our atmosphere comes from those 3 things. So climate change is being caused by fossil fuels, yet we've all grown up thinking that fossil fuels are what makes the world prosperous. You know, oil drilling is a geyser for money. And there's so much advertising that has been in many countries around the world, and certainly in my country, in Canada. We see it a lot in the US with the fossil fuel industry saying that it's essential that we continue to expand fossil fuels in order to be prosperous. Well, that's actually not true anymore. Renewable energy is now available at scale, and it's cheaper, and it doesn't poison us. Fossil fuels actually are the leading cause of premature death now on the planet, just from air pollution alone. About 8 million people die every year from fossil fuels, and that's not including the lethal heat and the storms and the floods, etc. So I started thinking a lot about that analogy, and looking at how our international agreements and our policy today constrain the production of fossil fuels. And I started doing that work when I was working in Alberta in the Canadian tar sands. I had been appointed by the government to help design climate policy for the tar sands, which, as you can imagine, was not an easy task. And the realization hit me there in that work about 10 years ago that my government and governments around the world see climate policy about reducing their pollution. That's what the Paris Agreement is. It's about negotiating who gets to pollute and how much. It's about emissions, which is only really looking at the demand side of fossil fuels, how much we use. And yet we're not regulating how much we produce. And today the world's on track to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal than we can ever use if we want the world to stay below 2 degrees and meet the Paris Agreement. So we're saying we're going to use less of it, but we're just creating more and more and more of it. And that aha moment for me was when I realized this was not just a Canada problem. In fact, it was a problem all over the world. And so I started convening diplomats and lawyers and researchers and academics about this issue, and realized that we're only trying to cut with one half of the scissors, the demand side and not the supply side. And that the Paris Agreement is essential. But if we're going to meet the goals of that international agreement, which doesn't even include the words oil, gas, or coal, let me say that again for your listeners. The only global climate agreement that we have in the world does not even include the words fossil fuels or oil, gas, or coal. And I think that is entirely because for 30 years, fossil fuel companies and countries that benefit from the expansion of fossil fuels have tried to make their products invisible, tried to make sure that no one constrains their ability to continue to produce. And that's a huge problem. And so that's when we started developing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. This isn't going to be solved by one country or one company, because most countries and companies want to be the last barrel sold. They know we have to use and produce less fossil fuels, but they all, when I speak to prime ministers and presidents and CEOs of companies, their answer is pretty much the same. Of course, we're going to use less fossil fuels, but if the world's going to use some oil, it should be ours. So they're all still overproducing, and no one's regulating or reaching agreements on constraining that. And so that's why we created the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty.
So there's a lot I want to respond to there. But first of all, the idea that you can somehow reduce pollution without reducing production, big oxymoron, because where do you think the pollution comes from? Just digging it out of the ground produces more emissions, but also, then you're using it and blah, blah, blah. It's just such an enigma. Like they claim on the one hand to want to reduce and get below 2 degrees, and then on the other hand, we're still actively doing, things like the tar sands, and the irony of having a climate person assigned to that project when it's going against everything. But
it made me feel in the first years of researching this like I was crazy, because I just kept thinking, well, wait a minute, why do people keep saying we're in a transition if they keep building more of the problem? Like, it's not a transition if you're still building out the problem. A transition means you've stopped proliferating. You've capped how much you're expanding, and you're transitioning to something else. And the language was just not true. It was a fraud. And this whole idea that it's okay if we continue to build fossil fuel infrastructure as long as you're reducing pollution is a bit of groupthink insanity. Like, what we build today will be what we use tomorrow. So for 30 years of climate policy, we're saying we're reducing pollution, but we're still building more of it. And then every year we miss our targets. And every year at the international climate negotiations and individual nation states go, yeah, we missed our targets again. We have to reevaluate our targets. We'll stop building it.
Yeah.
And let's put our money and our intellectual capital, our political capital, our financial capital into building the world that we want.
Yeah.
And so that's what this agreement is about. And in fact, we already have 16 countries who have endorsed and are participating in the development of the treaty, which is significant. It started with Pacific Island nations, who are often the most progressive on climate change because they're the most vulnerable. Like it's an existential threat for these island nations where sea level rise is happening, and cyclones and tornadoes have increased so dramatically. And they play a real kind of leadership role on the world stage on these issues. But in the past couple of years, those countries have been joined by many others. Colombia, the 5th largest coal exporter in the world. And President Petro, when he announced support for the Fossil Fuel Treaty, said, look, I know every day we're making the problem worse, but we can't stop on our own. We need international cooperation. And I think that's especially true for countries in the global south, in the Amazon and many countries in Africa and Asia, because they're being forced to produce more fossil fuels, to do more drilling and more digging of coal, just to feed their debt. And so they can't just stop. They can't just say, okay, we'll stop producing fossil fuels. I mean, Malaysia, 67% of their gross domestic product relies on fossil fuel exports. So if we're going to untangle our economies from fossil fuels and make sure that no one's left behind, we need some international agreements on trade, on debt, on tax, and those are some of the kind of more complex issues that we're looking at underneath the Fossil Fuel Treaty.
Yeah, so essentially, though, the overall idea is to get countries to commit to stop producing fossil fuels or to phase out and kind of phase in more renewable options. Is that kind of the gist of it?
Exactly. But it's not, that's the basic idea, but it's not to stop. Like, no one's saying we can turn off the taps overnight.
Right.
What we're saying is let's stop expanding the problem. So no new projects, no new investment, no new fossil fuel infrastructure. And then let's manage a wind down of who gets to produce and how much. Because some regions have it easier. They have a stronger economy, they have less people working in the industry, the industry is less an integral part of their social services and domestic revenue, so they can transition easier. Some countries are going to have it harder, and then it also needs to be fair. Like, a lot of countries aren't responsible for the problem we're in, because the majority of the carbon that's trapped in our atmosphere today, causing climate change, comes from the global north, comes from wealthy countries, Europe, Canada, the U.S. And so we need to take that historical responsibility into consideration too in the negotiations of the time frame for which countries need to act first and how quickly.
I do want to delve into the specifics of all of that and kind of maybe some of the things you're looking at and the progress you've made. But first, I think it's important just to go back to the basic question of why are burning fossil fuels bad? Because we've talked about this some in previous shows, but maybe some of our listeners are new or just need the refresher. So can you just give us a really quick breakdown? Like, why is this even a problem that we're looking at? You mentioned a few things earlier, but
we have seen an increase in the amount of in temperatures and in carbon by about 70% in the last 30, 40 years of carbon trapped in our atmosphere. And that's because of our use of oil, gas, and coal. And so when we burn those products, that releases carbon that gets trapped in our atmosphere. It has nowhere to go. So we're now at about 423 parts per million of carbon that's trapped in the atmosphere today. And that's what I meant when I said it's like a blanket smothering the earth. And we've known for many, many years. In fact, the fossil fuel industry has known the longest, since the 50s, that carbon trapped in our atmosphere will affect the living conditions on Earth. And so what we're seeing is a dramatic rise of floods, a dramatic rise of lethal heat, of sea level rise, and that is a direct result of fossil fuels. And that affects all of our daily lives. Food prices are going up. Um, Impacts in everywhere in the world. I mean, I live in Vancouver, Canada. A couple of years ago, we had a heat dome as a result of climate change. And that heat dome, 750 people in Vancouver lost their lives in 48 hours, just died from lethal heat, literally burning up. And I can remember, I'll never forget it, actually, walking down to the beaches near my house and this stench, like a wall of death, literally. And that week, the scientists estimated that 1 billion sea creatures had boiled in the ocean from the heat wave. So it was just like a massive death on the beaches, like fish and clams and mussels and everything just washing up dead. And this is in Canada, where you do not expect that level of heat, and we're not prepared for it. And of course, that's just, we have these examples every day all over the world, the floods in Spain and Bangladesh, etc. And so that's what fossil fuels are causing. Now, we use fossil fuels for electricity, for heating, for transportation, at primary uses, and we can now replace those with renewable energy. And it's already happening. This year on the planet, 1 in 5 cars sold will be electric. And that electricity can come from the sun and the wind, which is now way cheaper than fossil fuels. So when I started this work 30 years ago, renewable energy was really expensive. And the technology was not scalable. Like, you couldn't power a whole city with renewable energy. You could maybe do your house. Today, so much has changed. Renewable energy has now scaled. We can and are powering whole countries with renewable energy. It's now cheaper than fossil fuels in every major market in the world. And the great thing about renewable energy is that once you have the infrastructure in, no one owns it. The interesting thing about the fossil fuel economy is that when you get put in a power plant or buy a gas car, you're actually signing up for life to be dependent on someone else, who you're going to continue to have to pay for that gas, for that coal, in order to make your system run. With renewable energy, you're not. No one owns the sun and the wind. But that's also why the fossil fuel industry is fighting so hard, because it is a bit of an existential crisis. This is the most profitable industry in the history of human civilization. They've made about $2.8 billion a day in pure profits every day for the last 50 years. And so they're not going down without a fight. They want to continue to keep the world hooked on fossil fuels, because without that, they don't get those massive profit margins. And they've become extremely powerful with governments, because they are so wealthy. They can run ad campaigns that shift people's opinion, and which they do. They can commission science to say what they want it to say. And they have a massive fleet of lobbyists that are just inside our governments every day. And that's what's been holding us back.
It all goes back to money, doesn't it?
Oh, yes.
When you really dig into the problems that behind all of this, it's just capitalism a lot of times, just greed and people wanting to make a buck at the expense of the rest of the world. And it's really sad.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, Jennifer, because I actually think the shift away from fossil fuels is not just about technology. It's not just about energy. It's about power in every sense of the word. The fossil fuel economy has concentrated wealth and power into a very small group of people. And a renewable energy economy is a distributed wealth. And that shifts a lot of things. The fossil fuel economy supports, we've seen it. We've seen it so clearly in the last couple of years, from Putin kind of controlling and bullying, and attacking Ukraine, but then kind of bullying Europe to support his attack on Ukraine because of their dependence on gas, to now Trump doing the same thing. And in fact, I've had recent conversations with some ministers in Europe where they're realizing that energy security for them, having the experience of having gone from being dependent on Putin's gas to Trump's gas, they're really realizing that actually phasing out fossil fuels is an energy security strategy. It's not just a climate strategy. That if you are not dependent on consuming those products that you have to bring in from other countries, especially dictators, actually you're less vulnerable.
It's funny you say that because the US military years ago did a study and implemented a lot of it, a lot of what was in it, based on energy security. I lived near one of the largest army posts in the country in Texas, and they had huge wind farms that they leased
Mm-hmm.
and a giant solar array that they put in for energy security because it was looked at as a defense priority, as a threat multiplier, I think it said in the report. So, like, at least back then they understood this. Now the new administration's priorities, I don't know what they believe in that, but they they did. Like they recognize we don't want to be dependent, or someone could come in and take out our oil reserves or our electric
Yeah.
lines. So we want our own grid, and renewables are the way to go. Like,
No, and there's a lot of studies on that now, both in terms of the vulnerability of fossil fuel infrastructure to insurgencies, et cetera. I mean,
mm-hmm.
you concentrate the flow of energy and you're way more vulnerable, but also the vulnerability of fossil fuel infrastructure to extreme weather. You know, when you had all the blackouts and then major snowstorms, et cetera, for example, and the
Mm-hmm.
weird stuff that happened in Texas over the last couple of years,
Yeah.
studies are now showing that it was the renewable energy infrastructure which was less vulnerable, that actually
Yeah.
kept people alive,
Mm-hmm.
because it could still produce
Yeah.
even when the gas plants, et cetera, went down.
I was just going to say I was there for that, for snowbid, as
Oh.
we called it, in 2021, and they tried blaming it on the wind turbines freezing, and no, it was the natural gas reserves freezing and not being weatherized. Like, because we have a deregulated grid in Texas, they just they didn't keep up with it, they didn't weatherize it, and then a huge storm comes in and the whole thing almost collapses because, oh, business doesn't want to put the money into it.
Yeah.
It's not important.
Well, and
There we
we're
are.
getting weather increasingly that is unexpected. It's
Mm,
unpredictable because climate change doesn't just lead to warmer weather. It actually
right.
leads to more unpredictable
Yeah.
weather because of the storms that are now swirling around the planet as a result of, well, primarily the heating air currents in the heating ocean. And so we're just, it actually is, not only is it critical that we shift from fossil fuel systems and put in the infrastructure in place for electrification and renewables, but it's also critical that our governments look at adaptation. I mean, we need
Yeah.
cooling centers so that people have somewhere to
Mm-hmm.
go when the lethal heat happens. Last year, several countries put out notices telling their population not to go outside. You will die if you walk outside. That's how hot it got in
Yeah.
several parts of the planet. So we need cooling centers. We need infrastructure to keep
Mm-hmm.
people safe during extremely unpredictable weather.
Yeah, I I think a lot of people forget that a lot of the world still doesn't have air conditioning, and they haven't needed it for most of human history, I'd say. But now that the planet is warming, it is becoming something that's a safety hazard. Like you said, up in Vancouver, I imagine you probably don't need the AC on much throughout the year if you
No,
even
we don't
have
even
it.
have
But
air conditioning. We've never had air
yeah,
conditioning.
if you don't
Most
have it,
most homes in Vancouver because it never got that hot.
yeah. But then you have a heat dome thing, like you said, and that's fatal for people. So that's why people are dying. It's because they don't have access to facilities or just ways to cool down maybe. Um,
Yeah,
do
and the
you
fires are much stronger than they used to be. Like if you look at the scientific studies, you can see now that we not only have more fires, but in fact, when fires do erupt, they're unpredictable. They're way stronger because there is for so many reasons, but in part because
more
uh,
fuel?
more fuel. It's a kind of a tinderbox, and it creates pressure systems where the fires
Mm-hmm.
are so much stronger. And of course, we saw that in Lahana, we saw that in LA,
Mm.
previous to that in Alberta and Fort McMurray, and even across Canada when the forest fires erupted a couple of years ago across Canada. most of the U.S. was choked in smoke from our fires, and that
Yeah.
smoke is poisonous. That's the other
Yeah.
thing that we need to recognize is we actually need air filtration systems now, etc.
Yeah,
But I was attacked by the oil industry because I wrote during the LA fires and during the Canada fires op-eds calling the oil companies arsonists, because what people need to understand is these fires are starting because of our use of fossil fuels. And they're more prevalent because of fossil fuels. And there are now scientific studies that link climate events like major fires to about 70 companies in the world who are responsible for the majority of carbon that's trapped in our atmosphere today. And those companies need to be held responsible, because in the lawsuits across the US, like the one the California government is pursuing against big oil, we're seeing evidence that the oil companies knew this was going to happen. They buried the science, and then they deceived decision makers into continuing to support the expansion of the fossil fuel infrastructure that we rely on today. And that's why we're in this situation.
Yeah, I am interested to see the progress of a lot of the lawsuits that are started to pop up against oil companies, and even internationally. People suing from other countries,
Mm-hmm.
companies in I think I heard a South American farmer was suing a German fossil fuel producer or something, and if that if that works, that could be a very effective strategy, in some instances, but then they have to be enforced. So that's a whole other,
And it's a
whole other
time-consuming
discussion.
strategy, and that's one of the
Yeah,
things we don't have a lot of this time.
and expensive, I imagine. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, we've talked at length about the weather impacts and the health impacts, but I mean, that's not even counting the plastic that comes from these fossil fuels. A lot of folks don't realize, like, plastics are a fossil fuel product, and that's a whole other issue when it comes to pollution and health and the environment itself, and all that stuff. So there's a lot of reasons to phase out fossil fuels, and I'd say your organization is doing great work. So I guess going back to the treaty, can you explain how this agreement would differ from others that call for climate action? You've mentioned a couple of
Mm-hmm.
international agreements or just similar things, but what's different about this one?
The other main international agreement we have on climate change is the Paris Agreement that happened under the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. 30 years ago, when those negotiations started, Saudi Arabia did something really important. They put a motion on the floor that the process had to be structured by consensus. So when you have 190 countries having to reach consensus on every article and every motion, that by its nature means that those agreements are weakened, because you have vested interests, Saudi Arabia, even the US, who want to continue to expand fossil fuels. Well, they have a vested interest in making sure that fossil fuels don't appear in the agreement, and they were successful in doing that. If you look through the history of those negotiations, there are many times when stronger agreements are put forward, binding agreements between countries, and they were unsuccessful. And so now you have a consensus-based agreement that is based on peer review and peer pressure. It's not binding. It's not legally binding, and there hasn't been a lot of, and it's been difficult to achieve progress in that, especially on sticky issues like fossil fuels. The Paris Agreement is extremely important in that it set the 1.5 degree target. It starts to create work plans and pathways for countries to collaborate on funding loss and damage, on other financial issues, on technological transfers, and help and pushes countries to set and have transparency on their national plans for how to reduce emissions and pollution. So that's great. That's happening. But there have been no agreements, as I said, on production. So we started looking at how can we create an agreement that constrains fossil fuel production and helps countries to cooperate, that is binding, that has the strongest possible frameworks based on science and what's necessary to keep the most people on the planet alive. And we ended up studying 6 other treaties: the Montreal Protocol on CFCs, the landmine treaties, chemical weapons ban. And what we found out with those treaties is that they were actually created initially in an outside process. It's called a build it and they will come process. So 20 or so countries who have a high ambition on this particular issue negotiate the framework. It's a voting rules, not consensus. They're voting, they're creating a framework, and then offering to have other countries join. And eventually those treaties have been brought inside the UN. So the Ottawa Convention was what created the Landmines Treaty. It was actually Canada hosting a bunch of other countries to talk about how to constrain landmines and how that cooperate. Eventually that became a UN treaty. So we're modeling our political pathway on those processes. We now have 16 countries who are participating in the development of the treaty. We believe we'll have 20 by the end of the year. And so in 2026, we're aiming towards our first standalone diplomatic processes and conventions to start designing the treaty. In the interim, we brought on finance experts and legal experts to try and to recommend different clauses that could sit underneath a fossil fuel treaty that would be binding, that would have ramifications if a country didn't move forward on them. So, and those are the trade agreements and the tax agreements and the debt agreements that we spoke about previously. So once the countries do sit down to start negotiating a fossil fuel treaty, they'll have a number of proposals on the table for them of what the content could look like. And when we studied those 6 other treaties, within 2 years of negotiations beginning in those standalone processes, they had treaties. So we're hoping that once we pull the countries together, it will move really quickly. The phase that we've been in the last couple of years has been to build the kind of knowledge base that is necessary to develop a treaty, to build relationships with countries around the world and encourage them to come in, but also to build the campaign. Like, individuals around the world have been absolutely critical to this being even an option. It's a pretty big lift, a global treaty to stop the expansion of all fossil fuels everywhere. And the way we did it is literally from the ground up. It's faith groups. Every major religion in the world has endorsed the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And there are faith groups all over the world who are campaigning on it, and health groups, women's groups, environmental organizations, indigenous groups. And when I say campaigning, I mean they're raising awareness, they're holding events, they're putting motions forward at their city councils. We now have 140 cities around the world in every continent in the world who have passed formal motions at their councils endorsing the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And that's part of what created the nuclear treaty, is that cities really were trying to convince their governments, the federal and nation states, to go and negotiate a treaty. So we've been creating this kind of broad movement. We have businesses who have signed on, scientists who have signed on. So anyone can endorse the treaty, and then they can download action packages and figure out how to get involved in it. And it's a pretty diverse movement. It's 4,000 organizations we figured out now who are working on the treaty in about 117 countries.
No, that's incredible. When did you say you started this organization?
Well, we formally proposed the treaty for the first time 5 years ago. I did a TED Talk,
Wow.
Bad Math of the Fossil Fuel Industry. That was the first time we really publicly started proposing the treaty.
Okay.
The first countries only joined, I think, 4 years ago.
So that's a lot of progress in a short time, and to see that much grassroots activism as well is encouraging, because I think folks get hopeless when they live in a country where the administration is not very supportive, and I'm speaking from experience, of climate or environmental causes. So to know that there is an avenue to go through your city or your state or your locality and, show that there's support, and then if everybody kind of does that here and there, it adds up, I think. So
yeah, and states have started joining now too. Hawaii was our first state to join in the US, and now California has endorsed at both the Senate and the House the idea of a fossil fuel treaty. So there's There's a whole states piece that's starting. A lot of it is organic. Our secretariat is really small, but different organizations pick it up and say, hey, I'll try and get my state. Hey, I'll try and get these cities. And then they start working on it.
So what is that process for governments or organizations or even individuals to endorse the treaty? I saw on your website you listed kind of a breakdown of what you just said, all the different entities that had done it so far. So how does that work?
So people can literally just go to fossilfueltreaty.org. You can endorse as an individual. Any individual can endorse. There's also specific sign-on letters if you're a scientist or if you're a faith leader, etc. Right on the website. It's a little more tricky for businesses because we really didn't want the fossil fuel treaty to become a kind of greenwash. So businesses that are investing in fossil fuels or expanding fossil fuels could say, well, right now I have to do this. The transition takes time, but I'm still supporting the fossil fuel treaty, and then they would get green cred for that. So if you're a business and you want to endorse, you have to show and provide evidence that you're meeting the high-level expert group on net zero criteria, which were created by the UN for businesses and financial organizations. Our criteria are basically drawn from that. And some of the basic criteria is that you have to show that you are on a transition, both for fossil fuel use and production, that you're not expanding, and investment. And so we've already had 25 banks who have joined and endorsed.
Wow.
We have over 200 businesses. I think the most recent and largest one is Fortescue, one of the largest mining companies in the world. Dr. Andrew Forrest is a billionaire from Australia who has now made a commitment for his entire company to be real zero. So not even net zero. He's saying absolute decline in fossil fuel production emissions, no offsets, no credits. And they become the first major industrial company to endorse the fossil fuel treaty. Having individuals and companies and scientists, et cetera, is really important because this is a hard thing for a prime minister or president to do. Is the fossil fuel industry has spent so many years really convincing us through their advertising, et cetera, that are really fear-mongering about price and scarcity, that we can't survive without their products. And so we have to shift that social norm. And so it's hard. It's hard for an elected official to take a stand against fossil fuels because the pushback is so intense, and they're afraid the public won't support them. And so part of what we're trying to do is build the public support for the treaty so that, when a prime minister or president like Petro in Colombia wants to take a stand and support and stick his neck out to support this kind of leadership initiative, then they know that there's some support from scientists and businesses and others if they do that. And so the kind of movement building in the campaign is really critical to the success of the treaty.
Yeah. And is it, if this were to be developed and put into place, is it possible to be legally binding? I know that's tricky with an international agreement because who would actually enforce it? Or is there a different way to...
Yeah, no, the countries kind of enforce it to each other. What I didn't realize before I started studying treaties is a lot of what makes treaties binding is the agreements that are inside of them. So if you have trade and tax agreements, for example, inside a treaty, that those can be binding, because if a country then doesn't follow the agreement, then there will be tariffs. And we know that has some significant impacts on country activities.
Our favorite thing right now.
Yeah. So that's mostly how it's made binding.
Okay. And it's not like the kind of thing where you can fudge the numbers and say, oh no, we're not doing it, because you can see if you're producing fossil fuels, you can see it. It's not something you can just...
Which is interesting, right? Because for decades we've been trying to get a handle on climate pollution, but there has been a lot of fudging of the numbers. I mean, we see that all the time with the oil and gas industry. Now that there are satellites and cameras that can see how much methane they're producing, we find out that and then methane is one of the most potent greenhouse gases, and we're finding that it's way more. In massive percentages more than the industry had been reporting or governments had been reporting. So emissions are hard to track. For the most part, they're invisible, but production's not. It's pretty clear.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, you can't really, on an ESG report, you can't fudge that as much as you can. Yeah, we switched to this or that product, but wow. So So much to think about. I do want to go back to something you've touched on a couple times. We know that the wealthy countries in the global north are primarily responsible for most of the fossil fuel emissions in the world, and the poorer countries, a lot of times in the global south, end up experiencing the consequences of that. So, how would this treaty help address that? I'm interested, especially in what you mentioned about financing and maybe some debt forgiveness, because that's something I think folks don't really know about or fully understand. I know that's kind of a new concept for me. So,
Well, what a lot of how these kind of equity or historic responsibility issues have been addressed in the past relative to climate negotiations have been about, like, okay, wealthy countries, how much money are you going to put on the table to support these countries in the global south? You owe them. And I don't disagree with that. In fact, I agree with it. And super hard to do. Like, it's really hard to get countries to just say, okay, here's $1 billion, and so the amount that's been pledged through the UN framework on climate change process has been abysmally small compared to what's actually needed or what's been calculated as owed. And so part of what we're looking at is what is pushing countries to expand fossil fuels, and how can we basically relieve those barriers? How can we support equity in that way? And so there's a couple of ways that equity will be addressed in the treaty. One is around how much each country gets to produce and for how long. And so global south countries might have a longer lead because they haven't benefited from fossil fuel production for so long, and because it's going to be harder for them to transition. But also a lot of efforts being put into looking at issues like debt relief, or our most recent analysis, and all the reports are available on our website, by the way. We make all of our research public and free. And so we recently did a deep dive into what would a debt for renewables swap look like. So we get debt relief for a country, and they agree to allow, this investment in renewable energy in their country. We did a big study in the Caribbean region as a pilot to look at how that could work between countries, because there's debt swaps all the time between countries, but right now they're pretty bad. Like, for example, Ecuador is drilling in the heart of the Amazon right now, just to feed their debt, because they have a debt for oil swap deal with China. So they'll get debt relief as long as they provide barrels of oil to China. So that's why they're drilling. So how do we shift that? So instead, it's debt for renewables investment, or how do we simply encourage? There's also debt forgiveness agreements all the time for COVID, for other social issues. So can we coordinate some debt forgiveness in order to keep carbon in the ground? Because if you keep that oil and coal in the ground, you have so many benefits to the health and climate stability of all these countries. So for the countries in the global south who are, need that economic revenue, only to feed their debt, is there a way to give them debt relief and that decrease for their commitments to not do that fossil fuel development?
so sort of an offset. Sorry to interrupt. Is it kind of like the offset, or not? Maybe that's not the right word, but
yeah, I mean, in some ways, I mean, they're definitely, it's a you do this and we'll do this, but it's different than an offset, because what an offset usually does is allow people to pollute. So you're buying an offset so that you can say, okay, this forest sequesters this much carbon, therefore I can pollute this much carbon. We're well beyond those kind of deals now. We need absolute emissions and production decline because of the situation that we're already in. The planet is already warming. We are very close to 1.5 degrees, and that has meant that literally millions of people have been displaced this year, and hundreds of thousands have lost their lives. That will only increase exponentially. I mean, our oceans are now 30 to 40% acidic due to climate change. That, at 2 degrees, almost all of our coral reefs will be dead. What that does to marine biology, what that does to fishing populations, which a lot of
which are already overfished,
rely on, is going to be devastating. And so the impacts of allowing more of this carbon under the ground are literally life and death for the majority of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to be taking that into consideration in our economic and financial structures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole let's quote unquote invest in these countries, give them all this debt, and then extract resources model is just awful, especially when you're looking at it in terms of the climate justice and the problems that they're facing on top of, all of that debt that they've got, plus they have the incurred cost of their island nation is drowning, or they're being hit with
Yeah.
cyclones or floods or whatever. It's just, yeah, it's a hard
Well, and they're
problem.
really being pushed into making the mistakes that we made.
Yeah.
The global north has made. And that's one of the devastating things is we actually
Yeah.
have the technology today for them to actually just kind of leapfrog over the fossil fuel
Yeah.
and put in place electrification and renewable energy systems, etc.
Mhm.
But they're being pushed because of economic need into fossil fuel development because that's the cash that's being thrown at them. I've talked to a lot of governments who are like, we'd rather invest in renewable energy, but we're being offered all this money to do fossil fuels. And 95% of the renewable energy investment in the last year went into the global north, not into the global
Mm.
south. So people are investing in renewables, but they're not investing in renewables in the global south. They're pushing fossil fuels. And so that's something that has to shift. Because the fact is that the fossil fuel infrastructure just pushes a colonial model. It's not just a
Mm.
capitalism model, it's a colonialism model because
Mm.
it pushes dependency in the long term on those fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And most of the projects that are being proposed, especially across Asia, Latin America, Africa, these projects are being proposed for export. When I meet with folks in the network across Africa, their constant drumbeat is we don't want to become Europe's gas station. They're leaving
Yeah.
behind pollution, they're leaving behind destroyed rivers, they're leaving us, and and in fact, this energy isn't for us. Not turning the lights on in Africa. It's all being exported for profit.
Mm. Yeah, I actually just had this exact same conversation with the last guest on our show about why, for these countries that are, needing electrification and all this, why aren't they just going straight to the most advanced technology? Like, why are we
I'd
forcing
like
them? Yeah, and then they're going to have to retrofit like we are. We're facing this issue where a lot of our systems, yeah, we may have to transition, but
yeah.
they don't have to do that. They're going to, they could just go straight to renewables or whatever. It's just maddening.
But we're pushing them into
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I found out from a couple of countries in the last 6 months that when the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is doing right now renewing loan
Mhm.
agreements, it's requiring countries that are fossil fuel exporting countries to sign on the dotted line and show how they're going to increase fossil fuel
Mhm.
development and exports in order to receive their loans and grants. So we're literally forcing these countries into saying they're going to produce more fossil fuels at a time when the entire world has agreed that we need to produce less fossil fuels. Like, let's not forget, in Dubai, at the Conference of Parties on Climate Change, 190 countries finally put the words fossil fuels into the text and acknowledged that we need a phase out of fossil fuels. And the
Mhm.
science by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says no new fossil fuel projects fit in a world that has a safe climate, that we need to
Mhm.
stop expanding them and manage a wind down. Yet here the IMF is saying increase it. So we need to get all these institutions aligned with our climate goals.
Yeah, the left hand's not talking to the right hand, and ugh, it's just maddening.
I know. And it can feel
um,
so overwhelming for people. And in some ways, that's why I find it so exciting and almost a relief to work on the fossil fuel treaty because it provides so many points of access for people. And every
yeah.
day I turn on my computer and there's something so exciting, like, oh, the World Council of Churches is joined, and oh, this union in London joined, and oh my God, this group of people in Malawi just held a march through the streets holding fossil fuel treaty banners. Like, it really is a movement and it's happening all over the world, and there's lots of ways to engage. And we need that momentum. I think sometimes, hope isn't something we just get to have. It's something that we create through our actions.
Mhm.
And if we just sit and look at the data, it can become devastating. But
Yeah,
if you start working on something that feels like it has momentum, then, it takes on a life of its own.
and just knowing there's others out there around the world fighting the same fight as you can make a big difference when you feel so hopeless and isolated. Because
Exactly.
yeah, we're not going to fix this by ourselves. We have to have collective action. So
That's right.
kudos to you for doing this hard work. If folks want to support your work, get involved, how can they do that?
Fossilfueltreaty.org. Go to campaign materials. We've tried to provide everything that could be useful to you. You can download your placards, your banners, your how to get your city council involved, etc., and really make the campaign your own. No one owns the idea of a plastics treaty or a Paris agreement. No one owns the idea of a fossil fuel treaty. We're really encouraging people to make it their own, to campaign in whatever way they want to, and to let us know if they need support. The Global Secretariat is here to provide support for people to engage. So I think we make it pretty easy on the website. So I encourage people to join us.
Great. Yeah, and we'll link to that in our show notes, of course, for folks who want to learn more. We've covered a lot this last hour. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you want to talk about? One last plug.
I just want to say, after 30 years almost of working on climate change, one of the most difficult things is that it's so big, it can be overwhelming. It can make you turn away from it. And especially right now in the US, I think there is a kind of tendency to turn away from it. And I guess I would just encourage people to stare into the sun, to have those hard conversations about climate change, to get up every morning and kind of, as put on hope like a sweater, like by making a commitment to what you're going to do today. Focus on one thing that you can do with other people, and not just to what you buy. We're not just consumers, we're citizens. And this is not going to be solved by better light bulbs. It's going to be solved by better laws. And so I think that means that we need to engage. And so I guess just encouraging people to hold on to hope through their actions, and to continue to engage, because every action does matter. Every ton of carbon that we save from going into the atmosphere today will save lives.
Wonderful. Yeah, well said. Well, thank you so much for all of your insights and sharing, details about the treaty here. What are some resources you'd share with folks who want to learn more about anything we've discussed today, or just anything you think is important in this space?
I always encourage people to read the books of Rebecca Solnit. She's a big supporter of treaty, and we're a big fan of her work. Rebecca is an American author who kind of weaves history and politics and ecology together. Her book later, It's Not Too Late, is a compilation of essays on climate that is just amazing. Hope in the Darkness is also really, really good. On the Fossil Fuel Treaty resources page, we have all of the reports I referred to. People can take a look at those, and I think they can be super helpful. And I would also say that two scientists who've been very involved in the Fossil Fuel Treaty, who are doing tremendous work: Genevieve Gunther, who has a new book that just came out specifically on how to communicate on climate change, and Michael Mann, who also has a new book that just came out that is, really incredible. And so, yeah, take the time to read those works, and to do the research that you need. On the science end of it, there's one really amazing report called the Production Gap Report, written by the United Nations Environment Program, and that's the only report that really shows you this problem of fossil fuel production. Really the first one that ever did that. And on the basic climate science, the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, puts out summary documents, which just kind of like summarize the science on climate change. I think they're the best.
Yeah, I used several of those for my master's dissertation, so very helpful. Well, all great resources, and again, we'll link to those in the show notes. And if you're able to, utilize your local libraries to give them support and get some good knowledge while you're at it, to listen to those or read those books. I guess now we will move on to our green life hack portion of the show. So this is where we share one action or thing people can do to live more sustainably. So, Tzeporah, would you like to start us out with the green life hack?
I'm a mom, and I really think that children learn what they live. And so I think it is really important for us to be showing them that it's not just possible, but that it's fun. And so I would suggest looking at your transportation, make a commitment to yourself, 3 less car trips this week, and going to go out on bikes, going to take my kids on bikes or on a walk. It's healthier for our bodies anyways. And it just shows, and having that conversation about making that effort is really important in our families. But again, I would say the most important thing we can do is not just what we do in our lifestyle, it's also how we engage. So, I routinely write to my member of parliament, my MLA, my senator, and make sure that they know that I care about these issues and I want them to support renewables and not fossil fuels. And so I would say writing a letter or picking up the phone to your elected official is probably the most important thing you could do.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, my green life hack is probably a repeat of what I've said in the past, but it's just because it's summer, it seems appropriate to remind folks to check their sunscreen when they put it on for the chemicals that are bad for our coral in our oceans and our other life forms in the water. So check to see if it's reef safe or if it's got any of those nasty chemicals that are not good. I think I'm going to mess up how you say it, but the really bad ones are oxybenzone or octinazate. And generally, you want to look for mineral-based ones that will, provide protection but are less harmful for the water. So that's my green life hack for your summer vacations that may be starting soon. Um, Tzeporah, thank you so much for joining me today. I learned so much, and you gave us a lot to think about. Where can we find you online?
I am on Blue Sky X, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Just you can find me under my name, Tzeporah, or also the Fossil Fuel Treaty accounts.
Perfect. And I'm assuming that the Fossil Fuel Treaty is also on all the socials and everything as well.
Yeah.
Perfect. So we'll link to all that in the show notes. You can find the show anywhere you listen to podcasts on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. I need to get on the Blue Sky thing and figure that out because that seems to be a growing platform.
Yeah.
I personally, you can be found on Instagram at Het's Gonna Be Me, and if you're listening to this, please make sure you subscribe, like, give us a thumbs up, whatever you're able to do. We really appreciate it. Any support you can give. So thanks again for being on, Tzeporah, and everyone else listening. Have a great rest of your day.